Somewhere, right now, someone is getting up before sunrise for the 400th day in a row to do something that still hasn't paid off yet. Somewhere else, someone far more talented gave up on the exact same goal 11 months ago because talent alone got them further, faster, right up until it didn't, and they had no discipline left to carry them the rest of the way. Nobody is filming the first person. No one claps for a Tuesday. This is the longest episode in this series so far because hard work, real, daily, unglamorous discipline deserves more than a slogan. It deserves an honest, complete account of what it actually costs, what it actually builds, and why almost everyone underestimates both. The myth of talent. Here is an uncomfortable truth for anyone who has ever felt behind. Talent is wildly overrated as a predictor of who succeeds at anything difficult over the long run. Picture two people starting the same pursuit, a craft, a business, a sport. One has obvious natural gifts. Things come easily at first, and everyone around them says some version of, "You're a natural." The other is unremarkable at the start, competent, nothing more. 5 years later, it is often the second person still standing, and the first person long gone. Not because talent stopped mattering, but because talent, without discipline attached to it, tends to produce someone who expects things to stay easy, and quits the moment they stop being easy, because they were never trained to push through the difficulty the untalented person had to push through from day one. Discipline is not a consolation prize for people without talent. It is, in the long run, the more reliable asset of the two. What discipline actually is. Discipline is often described in vague, inspirational terms that don't actually explain anything useful. So here is a precise definition worth holding on to. Discipline is the ability to act in line with your intentions, regardless of your mood in the moment. Picture someone whose plan was to write for 1 hour every morning. Some mornings, they feel inspired, energized, eager to sit down. Other mornings, they feel flat, uninterested, tired. The undisciplined version of this person writes only on the good mornings. The disciplined version writes on both, not because the tired mornings feel good, but because the plan was never conditional on how they'd feel that day. This is the entire mechanism, stripped of all the noise around it. Discipline doesn't require feeling motivated. It requires being willing to act without it. The compounding effect of small daily actions. Almost nobody fails at hard work because of one catastrophic day. They fail because of an accumulation of small, seemingly harmless, skipped days that quietly compound into a completely different trajectory than the one they intended. Picture two people, each committing to a small daily habit, say, 30 minutes of focused practice at a skill. One misses occasionally, but mostly follows through, roughly 90% consistency. The other tells themselves 70% is still pretty good. After all, they're still doing it most of the time. Over a single week, the difference looks trivial. Over a year, it is enormous. Not because 20% sounds like a large gap, but because skill, trust, and progress compound. Small early advantages, repeated daily, produce wildly different outcomes a year out. In the same way, a small difference in interest rate produces a completely different amount of money after enough years of compounding. This is why discipline rewards people disproportionately to the size of the daily effort involved. The daily unit of work is almost always small. It's the relentless repetition of that small unit without erosion that produces results that look, from a distance, like overnight success. why most people quit before the curve bends. There's a specific, painful pattern behind most abandoned efforts, and understanding it might be one of the most useful things in this entire episode. Progress in almost anything worthwhile does not happen in a straight line. It tends to follow a curve that stays nearly flat for a long stretch, effort going in, with almost no visible return, before eventually bending upward, sometimes sharply, once enough has accumulated beneath the surface. Picture someone learning a difficult skill. For months they feel like they're not improving at all, despite showing up daily. This flat stretch is not a sign that the effort isn't working. It is, in most cases, the exact same shape every success story before them also passed through. It simply isn't visible from the outside, because nobody documents the flat, boring middle. They only see the finished result at the end. The tragedy is that most people quit during this exact flat stretch, right as the invisible groundwork is nearly complete, mistaking "I can't see progress yet" for "this isn't working," when in most cases, it was working the entire time, just not yet visibly. The discipline of boring repetition. Nobody warns people clearly enough that almost all real mastery is built on top of repetition so boring it borders on tedious. Picture a musician who spent years playing the same basic scales, long after they stopped feeling exciting or new. Picture an athlete running the same drills thousands of times, none of which will ever be filmed or celebrated. Picture a craftsman sanding the same joint, adjusting it by fractions of a millimeter, over and over, for the version of the work only they will notice. The unglamorous middle, repetitive, invisible, often boring, is not a detour on the way to mastery. It is mastery in its actual raw material form. Anyone imagining they can skip this part and arrive directly at the exciting, visible outcome is imagining a shortcut that has never, in any serious field, actually existed. Identity-based discipline. Here is a distinction that changes how sustainable discipline actually becomes over time. There is a difference between having a goal and having an identity. Picture someone whose goal is, "I want to get in shape." Every workout becomes a means to an end they haven't reached yet, which makes each missed session feel harmless, since the end goal is still theoretically reachable later. Now picture someone whose self-concept has shifted to, "I am someone who trains." For this person, skipping a session isn't just a delay toward a future goal. It's a small betrayal of who they currently understand themselves to be. The discipline is no longer propped up by willpower alone. It's propped up by identity, which tends to be a far more durable foundation because it doesn't require constant motivation to maintain. It simply requires acting consistently with who you've already decided you are. This is why so much advice about discipline misses the point when it only focuses on goals. Goals get you started. Identity is what keeps you going once the initial motivation inevitably runs out. Discipline is a system, not just willpower. Willpower, treated as the sole engine of discipline, fails almost everyone eventually, not because they're weak, but because willpower is a limited daily resource, not an infinite one. Picture someone relying purely on willpower to resist checking their phone while trying to focus. Every single time the temptation appears, they have to consciously fight it, and by the end of the day, after dozens of these small battles, there's nothing left for the evening's harder decisions. Now picture someone who instead builds a system. Phone left in another room during focused work, notifications off by default, the temptation removed from the environment entirely rather than resisted moment to moment. This person barely needs willpower at all, because the decision was made once, in advance, rather than fought repeatedly in the moment. Sustainable discipline relies far more on good systems, removing friction from the right behavior and adding friction to the wrong one, than it does on raw, moment-to-moment force of will, which predictably runs out under enough daily pressure. The role of environment. Following directly from the last idea, environment shapes behavior more powerfully than most people are willing to admit, because admitting it feels like giving up some credit for personal willpower. Picture someone trying to eat healthier while keeping a cupboard full of exactly the food they're trying to avoid. Every day becomes a fresh negotiation with temptation sitting a few feet away. Now picture that same person simply not having that food in the house at all. The discipline required drops dramatically, not because their willpower improved, but because the environment stopped constantly testing it. This applies far beyond food. The people you spend the most time around, the default apps on your phone's home screen, the layout of your workspace, all of it either makes discipline easier or quietly fights against it every single day, whether you notice or not. Discipline on the bad days. Every account of discipline that only describes the good days, the energized, motivated mornings, is missing the part that actually determines long-term success. What happens on the bad ones? Picture someone who slept badly, feels low, has every legitimate reason to skip their commitment today. The all-or-nothing version of discipline says, either show up fully or it doesn't count. This version quietly guarantees failure eventually, because everyone, without exception, will eventually have days where fully isn't available. The more durable version says something different. Show up at 40% if that's genuinely all there is today, rather than 0%. A short, tired workout still beats no workout. A few weak sentences written on a hard day still beat an empty page. This isn't lowering the standard, it's protecting the identity and the streak from being broken entirely by a single bad day, which is usually the actual mechanism by which people fall off a habit completely, rather than simply having one unremarkable day among many good ones. The ego trap. Looking disciplined versus being disciplined. There is a quiet trap worth naming directly, because it catches disciplined-looking people just as often as undisciplined ones. Picture someone who posts every workout, every early morning, every milestone, building a public image of discipline that, at some point, starts to matter more to them than the actual private consistency underneath it. When the audience isn't watching, the effort quietly slips, because the real reward had shifted from the private accomplishment itself to the public perception of it. Real discipline, the kind discussed throughout this entire episode, is built almost entirely in private, unwitnessed moments. And it has to be, because if it only survives when an audience is watching, it was never actually discipline. It was performance wearing discipline's clothing. Hard work as character, not just achievement return. Briefly, to an idea raised earlier in this series, two people can do the identical task and come out of it as different people depending on how they did it. Picture someone assigned a task they consider beneath them, something tedious, unglamorous, with no recognition attached. One version of this person does it half-heartedly, resentfully, cutting every corner available. The other does the same task with full attention, treating the care they bring to small things as a direct reflection of who they are, regardless of whether anyone will ever notice the difference. The task, in both cases, gets completed, but only one of these two people is quietly reinforcing a form of self-respect that will still be there long after the task itself is forgotten. Hard work, done with integrity even in unglamorous conditions, is not primarily about the outcome it produces. It's about the person it slowly builds along the way.
Rest as part of discipline, not the opposite of it. Here is a correction worth making clearly, because a lot of people misunderstand this in a way that eventually breaks them. Rest is not the enemy of discipline. Poorly managed rest, or the complete absence of it, is. Picture someone who treats every day off, every full night's sleep, every slower week, as a personal failure, a sign of weakness they need to push through. This person tends to burn out significantly faster than someone who builds rest deliberately into the plan, the same way a serious athlete builds recovery days directly into their training schedule, understanding that the recovery is part of what makes the following hard days possible at all. Discipline that never rests is not more disciplined. It is simply undisciplined about a different, less obvious variable, one that eventually collects its cost anyway, usually all at once, in the form of an injury, a breakdown, or a complete collapse of the habit altogether. The quiet reward nobody warns you about. Almost every conversation about discipline focuses entirely on the external result, the finished project, the achieved goal, the visible transformation. Rarely does anyone mention the other reward, the one that arrives regardless of whether the external outcome ever fully materializes. Picture someone who has shown up consistently for a long stretch of time, regardless of mood, regardless of visible progress. Independent of whatever external result eventually comes or doesn't, something has already changed in how this person relates to their own word. They have become someone whose commitments to themselves can actually be trusted. A private, internal form of self-respect that has nothing to do with anyone else's opinion, and everything to do with simple, repeated proof that they do what they said they would do. This reward arrives quietly, without an audience, long before any external achievement does. And for a lot of people, it turns out to matter more than the achievement itself ever did. The hands that did it anyway. There is a simple image worth carrying away from all of this. Picture a pair of hands, worn from repeated, unglamorous, unfilmed work. Not because the work was ever exciting, but because it needed doing, and those hands showed up for it anyway, day after ordinary day, long before there was any proof it would amount to something. Nobody photographs the 400th ordinary morning. Nobody claps for the boring middle. But those unglamorous mornings are, without exception, what every visible, celebrated result was quietly built on top of, whether anyone ever acknowledges that part of the story or not. The practice, not the moment. Like everything else explored in this series, hard work is never really about a single, dramatic effort. It's built the same quiet way discipline, patience, forgiveness, and peace with loneliness are all built. Through small, repeated choices that rarely feel significant in the moment they're made. The workout done at 40% on a bad day instead of not at all. The boring repetition returned to for the 1000th time. The private consistency maintained even when no one is watching to reward it. The rest taken deliberately, without guilt, as part of the plan rather than a break from it. None of it feels remarkable while it's happening, but it accumulates, quietly, invisibly, for far longer than feels fair, into a life that eventually looks, from the outside, like it happened all at once. It never does. That is the work of the hands that did it anyway. Not because it always felt worth it, but because they had already decided long before that they would show up regardless.